Albert Einstein wrote thousands of letters in his lifetime. Historians have catalogued nearly all of them. Scientists have studied his equations down to the last symbol. Biographers have traced almost every year of his life, month by month, sometimes day by day. But there is one name that appears in his letters, a real person, his own flesh and blood, who then disappears completely. No death certificate, no grave, no photograph, no confirmed record of what happened to her after the age of about 2 years old. Her name was Lieserl. She was Albert Einstein's first child, born before his marriage. Kept secret from almost everyone. Mentioned in a handful of surviving letters between Einstein and the woman who would become his first wife, and then, abruptly, never mentioned again. For nearly a century, most of the world didn't even know she existed. Historians only discovered her by accident in 1986, when a box of private letters between Einstein and Mileva Marić was opened for the first time. And even now, decades later, we still don't know for certain what happened to her. Did she die as an infant? Was she given up for adoption? Did she live a long, ordinary life somewhere, completely unaware or perhaps fully aware that her biological father was the most famous scientist in human history? There are theories. There is evidence. But there is no definitive answer. This is the story of Lieserl Einstein, the daughter history nearly erased, and the mystery that, even today, nobody has been able to fully solve. To understand how this story came to light at all, you have to go back to 1986, more than 30 years after Einstein's death. A collection of personal letters, exchanged between a young Albert Einstein and a young Mileva Marić between 1897 and 1903, had been kept privately within the family for decades. These were not scientific papers. They were love letters, intimate, unguarded, written by two people in their early 20s who were falling in love while studying physics together at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. When these letters were finally made available to researchers and later published, most notably in the volume The Love Letters, and subsequently analyzed extensively by Einstein scholars, historians reading through them found something nobody expected. References, repeated, specific, unmistakable references, to a child, a daughter. In a letter dated February 1902, Einstein wrote to Mileva asking about the baby's health, using the pet name Lieserl, a diminutive, affectionate German nickname, roughly translating to Little Lieserl, itself typically short for Elizabeth. At this point, Einstein and Mileva were not yet married. Mileva was living with her parents in Novi Sad, in what is now Serbia, at the time part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Einstein was in Switzerland, struggling actually, to find steady employment before eventually landing his now famous position at the Swiss Patent Office. This alone would have been a scandal by the moral standards of early 1900s Europe. An unmarried pregnant woman, a child conceived out of wedlock, for a respectable, if financially unstable, Serbian family, and for Einstein's own more traditional German Jewish family who, incidentally, largely disapproved of Mileva to begin with. This was the kind of secret that had to be buried completely. And it was. Lieserl was born in late January 1902, most historians believe around January 27th, based on cross-referencing the timing of the letters. She was born in Novi Sad, at Mileva's family home, away from Einstein, away from any public record that could connect her to him. Einstein, notably, never once visited. In the surviving letters, he writes about her from a distance, asking how she is, expressing affection, at one point even joking about wanting to hear her laugh and worrying whether she resembled him. In one particularly striking letter, he wrote asking whether she can already cry properly, and mentioned wondering what she looks like. These are the words of a father who was, in some emotional sense, engaged, but who never once, according to any surviving record, saw his daughter in person. Why would Einstein never visit his own daughter? The answer lies in the brutal social realities of the era, realities that are easy to forget from a modern vantage point. In early 1900s Central Europe, an illegitimate child could permanently damage a woman's reputation and, by extension, her family's social and economic standing. For Mileva, Already facing skepticism as one of the few women studying physics at a major European university, already navigating Einstein's family's disapproval of their relationship, the existence of an out-of-wedlock child was not just embarrassing, it was potentially catastrophic. Einstein, for his part, was in no financial position to support a child. At the time of Lieserl's birth, in January 1902, he was unemployed. Having only recently applied for the patent office position, he wouldn't officially begin until later that year. He was, by his own letters, anxious about money, anxious about his career, and many historians argued deeply conflict-averse when it came to confronting his family about Mileva and the pregnancy. So the decision, made largely by Mileva and her family, was secrecy. Lieserl remained in Novi Sad, raised at least initially by Mileva's parents, while Mileva herself eventually returned to Switzerland to be with Einstein. In January 1903, roughly a year after Lieserl's birth, Einstein and Mileva married. Lieserl did not come with her. This is one of the most quietly devastating details in the entire story. Mileva left her infant daughter behind with her own parents in Serbia and moved forward into a new, socially acceptable married life with Einstein in Switzerland, a life in which, as far as the historical and public record shows, Lieserl had no place. The couple would go on to have 2 more children together, sons Hans Albert, born in 1904, and Eduard, born in 1910, both of whom were raised openly, both of whom appear extensively throughout Einstein's later correspondence, biographies, and public life. Lieserl does not. After September 1903, when Einstein makes his last known written reference to her in a letter mentioning that Lieserl had scarlet fever, she vanishes from the historical record entirely. No further letters mention her. No death certificate has ever been definitively located. No adoption papers have been confirmed. She simply stops appearing in any document, anywhere, that historians have yet found. So what actually happened to Lieserl Einstein? Historians and biographers have proposed several competing theories over the decades since her existence became known. None has been definitively proven. Let's examine each one honestly. Theory number 1. She died of scarlet fever in infancy. This is considered the most widely accepted theory among mainstream Einstein biographers, including Michel Zackheim, who conducted one of the most extensive investigations into Lieserl's fate for her 1999 book, Einstein's Daughter. The theory rests on that final surviving letter from September 1903, in which Einstein references Lieserl having scarlet fever, a serious, sometimes fatal bacterial infection in the pre-antibiotic era, particularly dangerous for infants and young children. Scarlet fever mortality rates in early 1900s Europe, especially in less medically developed regions like rural Serbia, could be significant. If Lieserl died from complications of this illness shortly after that letter was written, it would explain her sudden and complete disappearance from all subsequent correspondence and would align with the grim, if common, reality of childhood mortality at the time. However, and this is crucial, no death certificate for Lieserl has ever been found, despite extensive searching by researchers, including Zackheim, in regional Serbian archives. An alternative theory suggests Lieserl survived the scarlet fever and was subsequently given up for informal adoption, potentially even without a formal paper trail, which was not uncommon for illegitimate children in this era and region, particularly to avoid any documentation linking her back to her biological parents. Some researchers have speculated she may have been raised by a family friend or distant relative, her true parentage deliberately obscured to protect Mileva's reputation and to prevent any public connection to Einstein, whose fame, though not yet at its later heights in 1903, was already beginning to grow within academic circles. Theory number 3. She lived a full anonymous life. The most tantalizing and least evidenced theory suggests Lieserl may have lived a complete ordinary life somewhere in Serbia or elsewhere in Europe, entirely unaware, or perhaps quietly aware, of her biological connection to one of history's greatest scientific minds, with no public record ever surfacing to confirm it. Michele Zackheim's research pursued this possibility extensively. She traveled to Serbia, searched regional archives, examined local records from the Novi Sad area from the early 1900s, and interviewed descendants of families connected to Mileva's side. She ultimately leaned toward believing Lieserl most likely died young, but she, like every other researcher who has examined this case, stopped short of a definitive conclusion, citing insufficient surviving documentation. Why is there so little evidence either way? This is, in some ways, the most important question of all. Record-keeping in early 1900s, rural Austro-Hungarian territory, modern-day Serbia, was inconsistent, particularly for illegitimate children, whose births and deaths were sometimes deliberately left off formal registries to avoid social stigma for the family involved. Combine that with the fact that Mileva's family had every incentive to minimize any documentation connecting Lieserl to Einstein, and you have something close to a perfect historical blind spot, not because of some grand conspiracy, but because of ordinary human, understandable secrecy, compounded by a century of regional wars, shifting borders, and destroyed or lost archives across the Balkans. Beyond the mystery itself, the Lieserl story forces a difficult reconsideration of who Einstein actually was as a person, separate from the equations, separate from the Nobel Prize, separate from the iconic photographs. Here was a man who, at the very same time he was developing the early conceptual seeds of what would eventually become his revolutionary theories on light and motion theories that would culminate just a few years later in his 1905 papers, was also a young father who never met his own daughter. Some biographers have framed this sympathetically: a poor, anxious, unemployed 22-year-old, unable to defy the crushing social conventions of his era, caught in a genuinely difficult situation with limited options. Others have been far more critical, pointing out that Einstein's later, well-documented pattern of emotional distance from his other children, his troubled relationship with his sons, Hans Albert and Eduard, explored extensively in other biographical accounts, may have had its origins in this very first, quietly abandoned relationship with a daughter he chose, whatever the reasons, never to see. It's worth noting that Mileva bears at least equal, arguably greater responsibility in this specific decision. It was Mileva who ultimately left Lieserl behind in Serbia when she departed to build a new life and marriage with Einstein in Switzerland. This wasn't purely Einstein's abandonment. It was in many ways a joint decision by two young people navigating a genuinely difficult and stigmatized situation. But Einstein's own letters make his awareness, his emotional investment, however distant, undeniable. This wasn't a man who never knew he had a daughter. This was a man who asked about her laugh, who wondered about her resemblance to him, who tracked her illness through letters from hundreds of miles away, and who, as far as any surviving record shows, simply let her vanish from his life entirely once his marriage to Mileva was underway. Historian Michele Zackheim, after years of research, described the situation with a kind of restrained sorrow, noting that whatever became of Lieserl, her existence complicates the tidy, mythologized image of Einstein as a purely benevolent, gentle genius. It adds, instead, a quieter, more uncomfortable dimension. A young man capable of profound theoretical insight and also capable of walking away from an inconvenient, socially costly truth. Even today, decades after the 1986 letters first revealed Lieserl's existence to the world, researchers and amateur historians continue searching regional Serbian archives, church records, and family histories, hoping to close this gap in the historical record finally. Occasionally, claims surface individuals or family researchers suggesting a connection to Lieserl through obscure genealogical lines in the Novi Sad region. None of these claims have ever been substantiated with documentary evidence that historians consider conclusive. But likely is not certain. And in the absence of certainty, the mystery persists. What remains undeniable is this: for over 80 years, the world's most documented, most analyzed, most photographed scientific mind had a completely hidden chapter of his personal life, a daughter whose fate we still, genuinely, do not know. So here's where this story leaves us. A letter, dated February 1902, asking about a baby's health. A letter, dated September 1903, mentioning a fever, and then nothing. Silence stretching across more than a century. Somewhere in that silence is a real human life, a real ending, whatever it was. A person who either lived and died as an infant in early 20th century Serbia, completely unaware of the extraordinary father whose name would one day be synonymous with genius itself, or who, perhaps, lived on, invisible, in a story too carefully hidden for history to ever fully recover. We build monuments to Einstein's mind. We teach his equations in every physics classroom on Earth. We know the exact date he derived E equals mc squared, the precise wording of his letter to Roosevelt, the smallest details of his most famous thought experiments. And yet, we don't know what happened to his own daughter. Maybe that's the real lesson buried in this story. Not about physics, not about genius. About how even the most thoroughly documented human being who ever lived still carried a silence he never fully explained, a silence that, even now, we can't fill in. Lieserl Einstein was born in January 1902. Beyond that, almost everything else remains despite everything we know about her father genuinely, honestly, unknown. Albert Einstein, 1879-1955. His daughter's story remains unfinished.